So thanks so much for joining us, Ashley. What I want to share first about Ashley is that she's a Sydney-based author here in Australia. Her most recent book, How to Be an Australian, is a memoir. And the exciting thing about Ashley is that she runs a podcast with her colleague James, which is all about writing, creativity, and health. So welcome so much, Ashley, and thanks so much for chatting with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Michelle. It's a pleasure to speak to you and your audience.
Thank you. I want to start first with, can you tell us firstly about your condition and how you came to be aware of it, what the experience was like for you?
Yes, so I had a very long experience of becoming ill because I had what's called Insidious Onset. And so basically I have chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah.
And I started to get days where it felt like I was coming down with a flu, and I didn't have any symptoms necessarily. And maybe I had like a scratchy throat, but basically I just felt exhausted. And I felt like my body was saying like, I'm dealing with something, you've got to lie down. Like I can't cope with anything. And so I'd lie down for a day or a day and a half or sometimes 2 days. And then I'd feel fine. I'd often feel really good. And I was like, okay, great. And I just go on with my life. And when it started in 2016, late 2016, there was enough people around who had colds or flus or whatever that I could sort of always explain it.
Mm-hmm.
But then in 2017, early 2017, it started to become every 2 weeks that I would lose at least a day. And I started to think, I looked around at other people in their early 30s and I thought, wow, like no one else I know is losing this much time to fighting off colds and flus. I'm never getting a cold or a flu during that period. But I was working, not full time, but I was working quite a lot. And I was also doing a master's degree full time. And I was taking really good care of myself. Like I was exercising regularly. I was still seeing my friends. I was eating properly. Like I wasn't, the sort of stereotypical grad student, eating chips and staying up all night. Like I was always in bed by 10:30. That's all I always have been. But I thought, okay, it's clearly just the stress from working and trying to do the degree. And I was submitting the degree in April. So I felt like, okay, I can make it through to April and then I'll feel much better. This is the problem, I'll feel fine. And then in May, after I'd submitted my thesis, it just got worse. It just got so much worse. And I had a birthday party and I was finally seeing a lot of friends that I hadn't seen very much while I was doing the degree. And so I'd invited everybody over and I got all this food and got this big cake and I was really excited to celebrate. And, people started showing up at about 7 p.m. and by 9:30, I was so sick. Everybody had to leave. I was just like, I couldn't stand up. So that's when I started going to the doctors. And I knew it was going to be a long road with the doctors because my symptoms were so vague. And there were symptoms that I was having that I didn't realize until later were symptoms.
Yeah.
But I don't know if they even want to help the doctors identify things. So I had what I now know is alcohol intolerance, where I'd have one drink and it felt like I had a glass of sand and I was just so parched. I could drink a liter of water after that and just still feel incredibly parched. And I honestly just thought like, oh, this is just, I'm getting older. I'm in my 30s now. I guess this is just what happens to some people. Yeah. But now I know that was part of what was going on. So the doctors started testing and they started at first kind of slowly. They picked a few conditions and they started testing for them. And then they would all come back fine. And like said, my symptoms were getting worse. I was spending more time in bed. I was working a 9-to-5 office job and I was finding I would come home from work and just have to just sit, on the couch and do nothing because I was so tired and I was going to bed 7 p.m. some nights. But then also I was still having days where I felt really, really good. And so the doctors kept testing and they, now it sort of expanded and they just started testing me for everything, but all the tests were coming back fine.
Wow.
And I had specialists say to me, on paper, you look perfectly healthy. And it wasn't that they were denying what I was experiencing. They were just saying there's nothing in here that is telling us what's going on. I had really good doctors actually. And so it took 6 months because chronic fatigue syndrome is a diagnosis by exclusion. And my doctor wanted to get me in with an infectious disease specialist, which was quite tricky. So it took 6 months of tests and doctors. And I had everything. I had the full body CT scan. I had a brain MRI. and they found absolutely nothing. And at that point, the infectious disease specialist formally diagnosed me with chronic fatigue syndrome. And so I learned later that there's two ways that chronic fatigue syndrome can come on. It can come on sort of very quickly, like a cold or flu would, and you just get sick and then you're sick.
Right.
I had what's called Insidious Onset, which they told me is about 40% of cases of chronic fatigue syndrome, which is that sort of slow, sort of creeping, it's like the Jaws music sort of coming for you, that pattern. And so that went on almost for a year, where it would get really bad and then I'd have some good days. But then one day in September 2017, I just I had that where I was like, I have to lie down. And it didn't stop after that. It just, in 2 weeks, I might have one good day where I could get up and do some things. But I, at that point, was so sick, I had to take medical leave from work. And I was at the point where I couldn't get up off the couch or the bed a lot of the time. I didn't have the strength to lift myself. So I had to get my husband to help me.
And can you sort of share with us, there's a physical experience of illness and there's an emotional journey of illness, which is just as difficult. And I'm wondering, that sort of feeling of being really well and then the fatigue coming again, how were you managing emotionally this level of experience?
Particularly that year, it was so confusing. In terms of the narrative we think about with illness, like any other illness or condition that I was aware of, you get sick either gradually or quickly.
Yeah.
And then you either you're at a plateau and then you hopefully get better, or you get worse and you die. But this sort of on again, off again was baffling. And it was so hard to explain to people. Because when people saw me, I was obviously, and it's still like this today, when people see me, I'm generally feeling good. I also get energy from talking with people, if I'm seeing friends and feeling good from talking to them. And so they don't see me when I'm too tired to sit up. I had 3 days last weekend where, again, it was at the point where even just I could get up and I could sit at the table and eat a meal, but that was exhausting. And all I could think about was going back and lying down. So emotionally, it was really traumatic, because I on a good day, I felt like I couldn't be real. I must have made it all up.
Yeah. I think this is really common, particularly for women with invisible illnesses as well. So I have a couple of conditions and I have vertigo. So instead of a migraine, I get vertigo. But you can't see me having vertigo, except my shoulders come up around my ears. But I look well. I look incredibly well. And I think this is a really interesting conversation to have, because I have this thing of it's nice that I look well, but then I have to explain or share or justify that I'm actually not well, and that's exhausting, and I don't want to do that. And one of the things I'm curious with about you is you've had this grad life, you've then gone on to employment, you've got all of this friends network and social world. How did you navigate that, not looking as sick as you are actually feeling?
Well, part of it was, at first I didn't even really talk about it, except that if I had social plans, I was canceling them, and I was telling people I don't feel well. Yeah. I'm not well enough to go out, and that was fine. But I, for example, was doing my thesis, and I didn't want to tell my supervisor that I wasn't well, because I felt like it was just an excuse. Yeah. But I was really struggling with the thesis to a degree that I wasn't even willing to acknowledge to myself. And then I'd sent her a draft to look at, and I got some really brutal feedback, which I was not accustomed to, because normally I'm an excellent student. And I remember sitting there trying to work through a rewrite of the thesis, and I felt like I couldn't hold the concepts in my head, I felt like they were like sand, and I kept trying to, I'm trying to combine these academic theories, and they were just slipping through my fingers. And I realized, looking back on it, that was the fatigue, that I was experiencing cognitive fatigue. But at the time, I just had no frame of reference for that. And I just felt like, oh, I wasn't concentrating hard enough. I wasn't working hard enough, like whatever it was. So I never mentioned it to my supervisor. And then later on, I actually, at the graduation ceremony, I told her that I'd realized how sick I was becoming. And with my work, it was the same. I didn't mention to them for a long time. I would be sitting there in the office, and I would be trying to accomplish just basic things. And if I had to change my screen, so I had to go from my email to open a file, for example.
Yeah.
To make a change in a document, I would click away from the email, and in that space of time, I would have forgotten what I was trying to do. It's like walking into a room and forgetting why you've gone in there.
Yeah.
And so I would just be sitting there at the desk, just like randomly clicking things and realizing that I couldn't accomplish anything. And now I've learned the term for that is presenteeism, when you're present, but you're not accomplishing anything because you're not well enough to, as opposed to absenteeism. And
right.
Yeah.
I sort of think of it that we often hear in the community of chronic, brain fog, which I just had in that second. And just that sense, like, this is very familiar to me, because there's that sense of my brain, I actually can't think, even though I'm right there sitting and looking at something. I haven't actually done anything hard or complex, but I can't hold the information with any clarity. And it's super frustrating. And it also can feel like it's some sort of personal failing, as if there's something wrong with you. And I'm just wondering whether you look at exactly like that's an internal conversation you've had as well.
Well, I mean, by the time it got really, really bad, I had been seeing the doctors, and we knew it was probably something like chronic fatigue. But I got to the point where I was still going into work. So at first I was still working my normal hours, but it would get to 3 p.m. and I knew I wasn't not going to accomplish anything after 3 p.m. most days. So I had to get as much done as I could before that, because from 3 to 5, I would just sit there sort of looking like I was working. But it got so bad that I lost the ability. I became illiterate, like functionally illiterate, because I couldn't remember from the start of a sentence. I couldn't hold what was at the start long enough to get to the end to put it together in a coherent way. So while I could read each individual word, I could get no sense from the sentence.
And let's just pause for a moment. I think it'd be good for our listeners to know, what work were you doing?
Oh, okay. Time? So I was working for the state writing organization, which is now called Writing New South Wales. Yeah. And basically I was the program administrator. So what a large part of my role was programming we did at the time 80 writing courses a year in all kinds of creative writing, poetry, novels,
right,
nonfiction, essays. And so I was administering that program. But one of my responsibilities was answering the phone and taking, we're a membership-based organization, so taking member details. So if someone would call to change their address or phone number, and so people would call on the phone, and I would have such a hard time taking down their information. At some points, just like I'd be struggling to remember how to write the numbers. I have really like visceral memories of just like that, like trying to tune out all the other noise in the office and just focus so hard on what they were saying. I had been offered a PhD scholarship after my master's, and it just made me realize how much like health is intelligence requires good health. Like you can't perform at a cognitive level if your health isn't there.
Yeah. And there's also that sense, what I'm hearing is, while there was this long onset, there was actually loss. There was actually this consistent sense of losing capacity that you previously had. And that changes your idea of what you can be and do in the future as well, that there's a grief and a loss for things over this time.
It was very confusing because it was inconsistent.
Yeah.
It wasn't like some days I'd go to work and it'd be fine and I could read my emails and I could answer the phone. Like it was it was never, once it came on. So because of the Insidious Onset, it was so inconsistent, and it's such a blurred time. And I had really good days. The very, very last thing I did before it came on full time was I had a friend visiting from Japan, and I took her for this 3-hour coast walk up in Sydney's northern beaches. And it was one of my favorite things to do. It was one of my favorite things to do. And I did that, and that was fine. Like, we were able to do that. And then the next day I couldn't get out of bed. But because it had been so inconsistent, I didn't know that it was here to stay. And so with my work, like, the conversation kept being like, well, maybe I'll be okay in 2 weeks. Maybe I'll be okay in 3 weeks. And they were sort of thinking, well, do we need to hire someone to take on parts of your role? And how would we do that? Because if you're going to be finding, like, I was like, maybe it'll just go away. Like, we still didn't even have, there was about a 2-month gap between when it came on full time. And I realized, okay, this is not just going to stop. And when I actually was diagnosed, and I realized just how long this was going to be.
And how did you find your workplace? Because obviously this is a small environment, I imagine, and while you might have kept it to yourself for a while, there comes a time when you can't not speak about what's happening.
Yes, I think when I started, not when I started seeing the doctors, but when it got to the point where I was losing significant time. Yeah. And I was starting to call in sick more regularly, because prior to that, I could sort of hold off to the weekend and then I'd crash over the weekend. Yeah. When it got to the point where I'd started calling in sick regularly, that's when I had to say to my employer that there was something going on. I didn't know what it was. But they were fantastic. It's a very small office. There was only 7 of us working there at the time, and they were really wonderful. I mean, it helped that I'd been there a couple of years. I had a good relationship with them, but they were. They've been, and they still are. I still work there. They've been so flexible and so willing to do what they could to keep me on the team. And my husband, actually, after I got diagnosed, my husband really wanted me to quit. Because it's a not-for-profit organization. It's the pay isn't amazing. Yeah. As not-for-profit is, particularly in the arts, but. It was a job that I really loved, and I was part of a community that meant a lot to me because I'm a writer. And he really wanted me to quit because he felt that I should be focusing as much as I could on getting better. But I had to give up everything else, like just one by one. I'd had to give up everything else I was doing, because I'd been doing stand-up comedy regularly for 1.5 years. And that was the first thing I had to give up, was because, and it was just really weird. This was very particular because I loved doing stand-up comedy. Even like I had sets, I'd get up and do my 5 minutes and not a single person would laugh. And it wasn't that I doubted the material, because I'd done that same set, the night before, and people laughed. So I'd do my 5 minutes, nobody laughed. I'd get off the stage and I'd be like, well, I had a good time. Like, I don't know about you guys, but like, I had fun. So I loved it. And then all of a sudden one day I just found myself like really not wanting to go out and do my set. And I was like, oh, this is really weird. Like, normally I love this. And what I realized was, it was my body being like, you don't have the energy to go out in the evening and be in this loud environment with all these people. And you don't have the energy to memorize, your changes to your material. You're asking too much of me, and I cannot do this anymore. And so I went out a few times and tried to force my way through it, and it obviously went terribly. And so that was the first thing I stopped. I was like, okay, well, I'll just wait till I get better, and then whenever we resolve this thing, I'll still start again. And then I'd given up, just other commitments. I had to start culling. So because my work was willing to let me just work 2 mornings a week, basically they brought in someone to fill my role temporarily. And they said, if you could just come in a couple mornings a week and just support her, like make sure she's on track and work with her, we can make this work. And then your job is there for you if you're able to come back. And so I really did not want to quit, because I realized if I quit, it was like the last tent pole holding up any structure in my week. Otherwise I would just be home 7 days a week. All my family's in Canada. And I've got friends here in Sydney, but really the only person I'm really close to is my husband, and he was working the equivalent of 2 full-time jobs because he had a full-time role, but then he'd also taken on this project he was offered that he was really excited about that like eventually did become his new full-time role. But in the interim, he had to do both at the same time. And that meant he was working up to 14 hours a day, going in on the weekends. He was not around. And so if I gave up that job, I was going to be 100% alone.
And what's interesting is that you were actually able to negotiate, and they were negotiating with you to keep you. That's what I'm hearing. That actually it wasn't just you negotiating to keep your job. They were negotiating to keep you, which is extraordinary and beautiful.
It was. I was lucky because I had a very particular set of skills, like in terms of my background in education, but also online teaching. So I like have experience in curriculum design and delivering workshops online. And they were at that time looking to expand their courses into the online space, which so good that we did that at that time because we were ready when COVID hit. We had built in an online component, and then we just basically flipped everything to online. So that it was good that we did that. So I was lucky in that like I had something they wanted that motivated them. But also they were just, lovely, understanding people, which I think makes a big difference as well. Like I think it helped that I had skills that were in demand, but they're also just lovely people.
And so you've had this experience, you get the diagnosis, you're also spending a lot of time at home lying down and your husband's working. And you also write 2 books. So how does this all happen? Like share with us the real raw truth of what did that actually mean for you?
So the writing is something I've been doing for a long time. And people say to me, actually, I'll be talking about being sick and they'll be like, yeah, but you wrote a book. And I was like, okay, wait, don't stop. Because books don't just get written.
That's right.
Particularly when you're, an emerging writer and you're new to writing and you're trying to figure out your writing. So it's a super long story, but the very condensed version is that I started writing a book in 2009 that was based on my great-grandparents' survival of the Armenian genocide. And it was a topic that I needed to research. And at that time, I was still in Canada. I did a big research project with my family in Canada. And I went to the community where my dad grew up and interviewed all the community and learned the stories, but learned also how much had been lost in terms of their stories. And that propelled me to go to Armenia. The first thesis I wrote here in Sydney in 2011 was connected to cultural identity in the Armenian community. So I'd started writing this book back then. And
so this is years and years before you were unwell. This is you at your peak working.
Exactly. And so I was really striving to develop a writing practice at that time. And, it's hard to put yourself out creatively and to do unpaid work and to not know if it's going and to not know if you're talented enough or if you have the capability to develop those skills. That's intense creative uncertainty. And I was also coping with anxiety at the time. So all of that was going on. But I kept pushing, and I had a friend who was sort of wanting to do the same thing. And we had this really lovely friendship where we said, well, we both want to do this. So why don't we just get together? We'll set a certain amount of time. We're going to get together at a cafe or library for an hour or 2 hours. And we eventually built it up to 3 hours, put our phones in our purses and just work on our projects. And then we had each other to rely on. And so once we'd done that for several months, I found that I was getting into a good routine and I could just sit down at home and do it on my own without all that sort of mental uncertainty, making it too difficult. So I'd been building up that writing practice for years, and I'd had a couple short publications in literary journals that, I was starting to build a portfolio. I'd written 2 full manuscripts by that time. And I started How to Be Australian in 2015. So that book I started a couple of years before getting sick. And I'm always working on multiple projects at once. I can never just work on one project. So I started that in 2015. I was working on something else. And then I got into the second master's program, which was the one I was in when I got ill, and I was doing a master's of creative writing. And so they'd offered me, I had applied for this thinking, there's no way I'm going to get into this. And if I get in, there's no way I'm going to get a scholarship, and it was going to be really expensive if I didn't. And then I got in, I got a scholarship. So I'd applied with a very particular project, which was to write about this series of terrorist attacks that were connected to the Armenian genocide that happened in the 70s and 80s. They're connected to the denial of the genocide. They were an effort on behalf of certain Armenian terrorist groups to get the Turkish government to acknowledge the denial and acknowledge the history. And they were doing that by attacking Turkish diplomats all over the world because they wanted to gain international attention. And one of those attacks was here in Sydney in 1980. So I wrote, for the master's degree, I wrote a creative project that was about, written from the point of view of one of those terrorists. And it imagines, he's a fictional person, but it imagines like what it would have been like to be that terrorist. And so that's a 12,000 word project. It's a very short project. Like a standard novel is going to be about 80,000 words. So I'd written this book. The first draft was 200,000 words, and then every draft cut down and down until it was 75,000 words. I was shopping it around to publishers, but I just even though I got good feedback on it, there wasn't a market for that book. So I did that project, and then I had this 12,000 word story that was like, okay, that was great that I got the master's degree, but it's like, what am I going to do with that? And so that was sort of sitting there, and then I had been kind of working on this a little bit just on the side because it was fun. Like this, the one book's about genocide. It's really dark. It's really serious, and you can see by the cover, it's like this is a dark, serious literary books. And then this book is like, at that time, I was using the stand-up comedy to sort of fuel the writing of this book, which was supposed to be very humorous. Because I was experimenting, I was trying to see what kind of writer am I going to be? Like, I didn't know if I was even going to write fiction or nonfiction, or I just knew it wasn't going to be poetry. I knew that. So this was all happening over years and in tandem. And then, but when I got sick, everything slowed. Like I said, there was a few months where I couldn't do anything because I was just, like I said, I was illiterate, and it's just everything, like brushing my teeth was a challenge. But once I got to the point where, at that point, everything in my life had stopped other than a few hours at work every week. And maybe a friend would pop over once or twice. But other than that, my week was totally empty. And most of that was spent in bed. But when I had a pocket of 15 minutes or 30 minutes where I felt okay, well, I had these projects that were on the go, and that it was just a delight to be able to sit down and engage in them. And because I'd already developed a writing practice and I'd already had a few publications, it was one of the few times where I felt like myself.
Yeah.
And so I was able to keep going because it was one of the few things I could do at home in the quiet. Like I didn't need anyone or anything else. I just had these projects and I kept going with them. So this one, like, as I said, this is fiction. It's the novella, the 12,000 word novella, and then a collection of 3 essays. And so there was an opportunity to enter the novella in a competition, and the competition encouraged you to write an essay about the writing of, and I was like, oh, this is great because I've got a lot to say about the writing of this. And so I wrote just, a 5,000 word essay, and I entered that in with the novella. And so it ended up winning. It was a finalist, and that meant that it was published digitally. But then the publisher came to me and she said, look, I'd love to publish this. I'd love to publish this as a book. It's not long enough to have a spine. Do you have any more essays or other works that would sit with it? And I said, oh, well, I've got these 2 previous publications, like from before I was ill. So we just combined all of that. And then the publisher did a fantastic job. She included a lot of my photos from when I was in Armenia. So like these are Armenian dancers it's a gravel soccer pitch at one of the schools I visited. So the publisher did an incredible job, but you can see it's a very skinny little book. And most of it was written really before I got sick. So that came out in 2019, which was just a real joy. Like we had a book launch, and after my wedding. It was just one of the absolute best days of my life. And it was wonderful because at that point I'd been in Australia 8 years, and, we had 100 people attend the book launch, and like every single one of them, other than my husband, every single one of them were people that I'd met since arriving in Australia. And everyone from my work was there, and from the Armenian.
You were well enough to go to your own book launch.
Yeah, by 2019, this was like April 2019. Yes, it was a wonderful, and I had to say, it's like anything like that, I sort of had to clear the week, but it was, yes. I felt, at the book launch, I felt amazing. Yes. Afterwards, I felt terrible, but it was very much worth it.
And I think this is one of the conversations that you and I've had as well, including today. We had this conversation over Twitter about managing capacity and this equation of, if I want to do something, then I have to work out what the cost of that is going to be, or what the price is going to be. And as much as it would be lovely to be able to do everything, I've sort of learned that that just is part of the practicality of living with chronic illness. And you sort of work out, well, I'm prepared to pay 3 days in bed to have this one moment. And it feels to me like that's often connected to our identity. And you've touched on this notion that writing was the one place you felt you were connected to the fullness of your identity. And I'm wondering if there's anything else you would like to share with people, because you've spent time thinking about this process. Identity, the illness, before, now. What sort of thoughts and consequences or helpful tips you would have for people going through a transition in their identity?
I guess that was the one thing for me. I felt really lucky because, as I said, I had a series of years where I'd gradually committed more and more and more to the writing practice and to the idea of myself as a writer, which was terrifying. It was terrifying to do that. And for example, I'd had a different job that had nothing to do with writing, and I left it to work for the Writers' Center, which meant taking a 50% pay cut. Yeah. But I was willing to do that. I mean, I was lucky enough that I was able to do that because my husband has a good job. So I was able to do that because I knew I wanted to commit to the writing community and to my future as a writer. So when I got sick, I already had that writing practice. And the one thing about that, getting sick really made me realize if I can't do anything else, I know I want to do the writing. And that was so reassuring, was to know that actually that was the one thing that really, really mattered to me, and that I was still able to do that. And even though I lost so much else, like the ability to go, for a hike, I live in a city that's full of gorgeous, like, coastal hiking trails, and I can't go to any of them. And we live, close to the Blue Mountains, and I can't go and do any of the hikes there. But I've sort of lost so much, but I could still do the writing. And
did the illness change your sense of, in any way, the sense of you as a writer? Because I want to, we're going to share also the things that you've written about also include writing about chronic illness and very personal stories.
Well, so it's interesting with this book because, as I said, I was doing stand-up comedy and I was writing this book that I intended to be. The original idea was it was going to be a collection of humorous essays, each around a topic related to, Australia and things I'd learned about Australia as an outsider.
And this is your second book that we're talking about now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, my second published book, because I've written about 5 manuscripts, but this is the second published book, which came out in June 2020.
And it's called How to Be an Australian.
Yeah. And so, actually, here, I'll show you. So I had a lot of writing. I'd already done, I'd done a partial mentorship with a humor writer here in Australia. And I had all this material, and I had just sort of started shaping it and experimenting. And one of the things that I'd realized was that the idea of the collection of essays wasn't going to work. It was going to be a much stronger book if it had a chronological story that sort of pulled the reader through it. So I sort of re-envisioned it and started with day one, we arrive in Australia, what's it like? And so when I got sick, I had all this humorous material that I'd been collecting and we'd been working with and experimenting with. But then when I came back to it, and as I got back into the writing, you know, I could do these little bits of time, and at first it was only a few times a week, and then it built up and built up and built up. And I was using sort of a structured approach to building up my capacity that the doctors had given me and taught me how to do. And what I found was the humor was not there. Like and all the humor in this book, like 90% of the humor that's in the book now was written before I got sick.
Yeah.
What I wrote after getting sick is the emotional core of the book. That's when the book started to take on this emotional depth, which is, you know, about sort of moving from what's called the Odyssey phase in life, which is when you graduate from university, you finish your schooling, and you've got these like beautiful, wonderful years of like being an adult, but you don't quite have the responsibilities of an adult yet. Like if you're not married and you don't have kids, and maybe you're not committed to a serious career at that point, but you've got this incredible freedom. And I had waited for that. I did not enjoy being a child. I wanted to be an adult so badly. And then as soon as I graduated from university, I moved to South Korea. I started to move to Spain. I ended up in South Korea. That's a different story. Spent a year in South Korea. I went and volunteered in Peru for 6 months and traveled around South America. I traveled around Southeast Asia. I went and lived in Mexico and worked for a year, and I loved it. But then I had the opportunity to get married to someone I really, really loved, and he had a very serious career. So I managed to, it took me 8 years, but I convinced him to move with me to Australia. And I said, like, okay, we can get married, we can do the adult thing, but like, I just need you to experience life outside of Canada for like 1 year. And then after you've done that, if you want, we can move back to Canada and we'll figure things out from there.
So all of the part of the book that covers this you had written before you became unwell?
Well, I had written, no, actually, most of what I'd written about was just comedic things about Australia, like about, like they've got these, they call them biscuits. They've got these cookies called Ice Bobo, and they look like a woman's private parts. Like the way they've got like, it's like this pink icing with like shredded coconut. And like, that's to me, I'm like, that's the first thing I think about when I look at these. I'm like, and then you name them Ice Bobos. I'm like, what are you implying with these?
These are my childhood cookies. Like these are the most favorite thing that my 5-year-old self loved and loves. So I'm really getting a feel for the outsider perspective on Australian culture here.
Yeah, there's so much of that kind of stuff in the book. Like there's so much of that. Or the fact that like kookaburras have been used in Hollywood movies as the soundtrack for Monkeys, because some Hollywood producer back in the 30s, it turns out, decided that kookaburras sound more like monkeys than monkeys actually do. So just all kinds of random stuff like that. So that was all written before I got sick. But then after I got sick, it was writing about how I felt like when we moved here for a year, and that first year was great. But then it was like when my husband said, like, I've got a really good job here and we both really like it here. Why don't we stay for a while? Like this open-ended, let's just, you know, I can get a work visa through my work. That's for 4 years. Let's just see what happens. And I realized, oh, okay, this is adult life as you make these compromises. Like we're staying here for his career, which was fine. But it meant that I had to I had no control. And all of a sudden I was like, I'd finished that master's degree. I had no job. The career that I thought would, develop from that master's degree I was totally wrong about that. So I had no career prospects at that time. And then there's this vacuum in my life now. I'd been this traveler. I'd lived all over the world. And now I'm like, well, I like Sydney, but I don't have a life here. Like I've explored everything. I've done all the tourist stuff. Like, and now I'm just sort of sitting here. And so into that vacuum, just anxiety, just like all of a sudden, my anxiety started to spiral and get really bad. And so I hadn't intended to include, and then what does that mean for your marriage? Like, what is that?
Yes.
How does that affect the marriage? When you've got one person who's got a great career path and prospects and is perfectly happy to take that year by year, and you've got someone else who's just sort of spiraling and being like, I don't know what I'm doing with myself. All I know is that I'm trapped here, and it's not that I want to leave, but it's also not that I want to stay. So I had not planned to put any of that in this book.
Right.
But that became the core of the book because at that time I was coping with with challenges in the marriage. And so it funneled, all that emotion funneled its way into the book. So the book is on the surface a very, very funny book about an outsider's perspective on Australia and how I think isovos are inappropriate. But
Okay.
at its core, it's about being young, being a young adult and coping with what that means, and being married and making decisions, in an adult way, and coping with mental illness.
And then you've talked about this and you've written about it, and I think it would be beautiful to explore here for our listeners as well. The marriage was something that was complex and the illness came along. So I'm wondering, you've talked about actually what was going on for you, and how do you manage somebody having a career in bloom and the other person having it's a struggle to work out who I am in this moment and at this time, and you have to work out your own life in that while somebody else is blooming. Like, none of that is easy. So how did you work through that?
Well, my husband and I are very different people. He's an accountant. Well, he was an accountant, and he was an accountant for, up until very recently. So for a long time, he had about 20 years as an accountant. And we love each other very much, but he comes from a family and a family culture where you don't talk about emotions. Like, it's very English in that sense, right. Like, and very Australian as well. Like, just pretend all that stuff doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I come from a family that's a lot more emotive and expressive, and also just as an individual, I'm just someone who talks about emotions a lot and has a lot of emotions, has a lot of big emotions. They're always happening all the time. So we had those differences, but I think, our differences had been building up, and, sort of those cracks were starting to spread. But because we've been so busy, once I had, sort of started to figure my career thing out, and Steve is wonderful. He encouraged me to lean into the writing. He said, well, you've got this time, you want to write this book, just do it. And so actually, in 2012, sent me off to Armenia on my own for 2 months so I could do my research, and funded that, and he was very, very supportive of everything. What had happened was we had both been applying to postgraduate programs for a few years, and it happened that we both got accepted and both got into master's programs with scholarships at the same time. And he was working full-time and doing his program full-time. I was doing my program full-time and working part-time. And we were like, okay, when it started, we were like, all right, this is going to be really hard 2 years. But right. We're just going to push through it. And when it's done, we will then make sure to take some time to reconnect and do more fun things together and take more time off together. But we knew we were going to have 2 years that were going to be very, very intense.
So what I'm hearing in that is you said we're actually two individuals. We both have aspirations from our individual self, and we're going to make an agreement about how we're going to manage this next 2 years of time while we each pursue our individual goals. Mm-hmm. Is that an accurate summary?
Yes, absolutely. So, and we did, and we were, good partners in that. There was a lot of stress, but we were good partners until I started to get really sick. And unfortunately, that in 2017, when things got worse and worse and worse, his program was incredibly stressful, and he struggled to cope. I think because he didn't anticipate the ways it would be stressful, because it wasn't just stressful because of the workload, it was stressful because of personalities and expectations.
Right.
And so he was under a lot of stress. His 40th birthday happened during that time, and I just his skin just started to turn gray from the stress. And I had said, my program wraps up in April, yours ends in October. I will, I need a lot of help now, but I will be there for you, and I will make sure that I get you through the end of your program. And particularly September and October were going to be quite difficult months for him. And of course, that is when I got so sick that I couldn't function. And I think in some ways he was really great about it because he never complained. He never, he encouraged me to leave my job so that I could focus on my health. He never complained about having to take on the 100% of the financial burden. He paid all the bills. He did all the chores. He did all the cooking. Like, in a lot of ways, he was wonderful, but he would not talk to me about being ill.
Right.
He came to only a couple of my doctor's appointments. One of the appointments he came to was with the infectious disease specialist, who said, you've got chronic fatigue syndrome. That's the only explanation for this. And he said, generally it lasts 3 to 5 years. It could be 10 at the outset. And we walked out of that appointment and Steve went, "Isn't that great? You're going to get better."
Wow. So you heard completely different things in that appointment.
It was like he'd skipped over everything I was going to have to go through.
Yeah. And that, for me, brings up the notion of being unseen in your actual lived experience. And that in itself is stressful and distressing.
Yeah. And I could not convey that to him. He just was not willing to hear that. And he kept telling me, well, you just got to be positive. You're just going to have to get through it.
Wow. Yeah. And how did that make you feel? Like that starts to widen the gap. Like, I can see then, okay, this illness is physically demanding. It is personally, emotionally demanding. And we are not on the same playbook in our marriage agreements about what this actually means.
And I could call my parents via Skype, and had a couple of close friends I could call, but the time difference between Australia and Canada is quite difficult. And also when people can't be there, like, I think I would have had a different relationship with my parents in terms of like coping with the illness if they had been here. Yeah. Because they were far away and they couldn't do anything. I didn't want to burden them like unnecessarily. Like, I told them what was happening and I was honest, but I didn't tell them how hard like certain aspects of it were, like that aspect. Like, yeah. And I knew it could have been worse. Like, I'm very grateful for everything that Steve did do, but I like, things started to get bad. Things started to get really bad because like, he wasn't here, and he could have physically been here more, because he could have, like, in the evenings come home and worked from home. Yes. Instead of choosing to stay at the office. But I saw that as like, he just didn't want to deal with me. Yeah. And so I was alone from when he left, 8:30 in the morning till 9:30 at night when he came home. And I told him, I'm like, I cannot cope with being alone this much. But he would not come home earlier. And there were times where like I would call him, and I think it was hard for him because one day I would be too tired to get up and I would need help getting up, and he'd sort of act like I was burdening him by asking him for help, like getting up from bed. But I was like, I know, like, the day before I'd been able to get up on my own, like very slowly and difficultly, but I could do it. So like the inconsistency did not help, because I think if it had been the same every day, he would have just been like, okay, this is what I need to do. It's a routine. Yes. But because it was up and down, I don't think he actually thought I was exaggerating my symptoms. Yeah. But I think maybe he wished that I was, because then I could just stop it.
And I think there's something about the invisibleness of it, that there's no sign to him of the difference. And I would like to pause in this moment, because I think this will be really useful for people listening. One of the things I found for myself is you can't see the vertigo, but there's a particular type on the day where there's a vertigo caused by something else, where my eye movement changes. And on those days, Cliff can tell that I've got vertigo.
Interesting.
And on the other days, the vertigo comes with two different conditions. Comes through your ears, mm-hmm. which is benign with crystals in your ears, and the other one comes as a result of the migraine. But I found freedom in, at least on some days, he got a physical sign and could see how dramatic it was by watching my eye movement. So I found that really liberating, because there was validation. He could actually see it. On the other days, when it's caused by a migraine, you can't see it. but he had some
Right.
sense. And so there is something about the invisibleness of nobody actually being in your body and having the feeling, and you are trying to minimize it to the best of your capacity and only ask for help in the most extreme cases. And that's what I'm hearing was going on, not just for you personally, but in the marriage with all of the pressure that was building and building through the marriage. So where did that all go for you, Ashely?
It got really bad. It got to the point where when he did come home, I would use all the energy I had and several days worth of energy. And we'd just often be fighting. We just, and I, like, my emotions would get worked up, and all of a sudden then I had energy because I was so worked up because I was so mad. And I just kept trying to get through to him, like, just how much I was suffering and how much he was aggravating it. And if he could only just, I would felt like I was not asking for a lot. Like, I just wanted him to come and sit with me and acknowledge what I was going through. Like it's great that you're doing the dishes and you're getting the groceries and all that stuff. Like, that's fantastic. But actually, like, don't do that for a day or two. I don't care. Just please come and sit with me and just be with me, because I'm just suffering. And when, like, you brought up grief earlier, and I just felt like that all went completely unacknowledged. And I just found that it was like living with a robot, and I couldn't bear it. And it got to the point where if I had been well enough to leave, I would have left. Yeah. But at that point, I couldn't even, there was no way I could fly as far as Canada, even if I had made the decision to actually go home and stay with my parents. I couldn't physically get there.
Yeah.
And also I would have no money.
Yeah.
But I also knew that if I was well enough to be working and to be living my life, things would not be that bad. So then it just kept going in this cycle of, like, well, it's my fault because I'm ill, but that's not actually my fault. So he needs to do something because I can't do anything. And then I try to explain that to him, and I'd start off trying to explain it rationally. And then, just so.
And he's got his list of all the things that he's doing and the way he's showing love. And it's like you're yelling at each other, but nobody can actually hear the two hearts in their vulnerability, because you're each in your own vulnerability.
Well, and he would just shut down and stop talking to me. Yeah. That was generally, and that had happened previously in arguments. That wasn't a new thing. It was just everything was so exacerbated. It was so bad. So it got to the point where I said, like, look, we have to go to counseling, because, like, what else can we do here? And I'd said there had been times before where I'd sort of thought, I'd proposed, like, oh, maybe we should do something like that, because I'd seen all kinds of, counselors and psychologists for anxiety and depression previously in my life, whereas he had never done anything like that. And I knew it had gotten very bad, because he agreed. He was like, yeah, that's fine. If you want to set that up, we can go do that. And so I was lucky. Again, at that point, I was well enough to go. And, we were going once every 2 weeks for an hour. So I could go. And I had explained my condition to the counselors, the counseling office, and they had said that they would waive their normal, like, normally you need 48 hours to cancel. And they said they
great.
were flexible with that.
So this is so wonderful that even in that time, you still took the risk of telling people, one, because it was necessary, but you took the vulnerability to tell people as well.
Well, mostly because I wasn't willing to lose that money. I was like, this is expensive. Yeah. And I'm not willing to lose this money. And they were very good about it. And I think maybe there was one time where I actually had to cancel last minute, but so the just having the space to talk, with like sort of a referee there, just changed the dynamic a lot. And that helped so much. But also they gave us a lot of tools. And I mean, it was hard work, because we had to learn these tools and learn how to use them with each other. And Steve finds, because of his upbringing, he finds talking about anything emotional exhausting. So his tolerance was very low. We could only do so much. And then that was kind of it for him. And then we have to wait a few days before we could try to do anything else. So it took some time. So, and it wasn't like there was like a moment where we were like, oh, okay, like that's we can, now things are better. But it was just gradually, like, looking back over months, you'd be like, oh, and it was sort of the same as with the illness. You'd look back over several months and be like, oh, okay, like I can see the progress I've made here. Like I actually am getting better. It's just it's like a tree growing so slow. But I think one of the most valuable things that the counselor said to me was that some people use work as a safety blanket, and that, like, that's how they process their grief, is they go to work because it's a safe space for them. Yeah. And that made me realize that, like, that made me able to forgive Steve for all that time, because I realized that I'd just been looking at it through my perspective, where I would never use work in that way. Yeah. But I realized that she was, that was what he had been doing. And so that didn't make it okay, but it made it forgivable.
And were there anything in particular, now, how would you describe your relationship firstly? Like, what is the process been like then now for you? What's the outcome?
It's so much better. It's amazing. Because when we went to the counseling, I did not believe the counseling could make our relationship better than it had been before I got sick. I was just hoping the counseling would sort of be like a Band-Aid that would get us through the worst of the illness. And then as I could return to the person I had been before, because Steve and I lost a lot of the things that he and I had done together that sort of made our relationship good, like going hiking, for example. All of a sudden he had lost the person that, he did those things with. And so our relationship just was like maintaining the household. Like there was nothing else. And we'd been in a public speaking club that we had co-run. And that was, again, one of the things that I had to quit very soon. So he'd been going on his own for a while. And so he would sort of tell me about things that were happening there, but I couldn't be involved at all. And so I was just hoping we could just get through this and then get back to normal. But actually, it was so good that we took the time to learn these tools and to learn to interact with each other differently and to better understand each other's underlying psychology. Because now our marriage is just so much better. It's just such a relief. Like it just, and when we have problems, we can work through them. We're so much better at just actually talking about what the problem really is instead of talking about how we personally feel offended by the problem. So it's been really, really good. It's been such a relief because I still am home a lot. I still, I can see friends more often now, but it's still nothing like I used to be out all the time. Like I used to be out 4 or 5 nights a week. Yeah. And Steve and that was another factor, was that Steve he's a very introverted person. He works very hard. He likes to come home and unwind by himself. He doesn't need a lot of socializing. And so that worked well for us because I was out, I was doing my things. I was with my friends. I was, going to writing events and book launches and doing my stand-up comedy. And he had his time alone to unwind. And then all of a sudden he has this sick, unhappy person in the house all the time.
All the time.
So, and I acknowledge that, I knew that. But now, I mean, it's still very rare that I go out without him. Like in a good period, it's maybe once a week. So, and I try to, if I can, so he can have that downtime. But it's like, even though I'm here a lot and we're, we live in a 1-bedroom tiny apartment in urban Sydney. Like we don't have a lot of space. There's like one door he can close basically, unless he's in the bathroom. There's like one door that can separate us. So, but it's so much better now. It really surprised me how much better it got.
And what I'm really hearing is that it feels like the illness, as difficult and as complex as it was, it made you, it compounded things, but it also made you face things that were already in the relationship that potentially over time, even if it took longer time, would still rise. Like communication styles is a pretty fundamental thing in any relationship. I'm wondering, are there other things that you would now say, while nobody would wish to be ill, perhaps there are things that you feel it did bring you in your own personal strength and development?
Again, what you said is absolutely true. I think probably we would have been pushed to that point in our marriage at some point, and this was just the thing that made it, like, it turned it into a crisis. And I'm like, as I've said, I wish we'd done that years before, but we probably wouldn't have, because our lives were full and we were busy and we could just, kind of ignore things. And I also want to add, we did not spend, I said the counseling was expensive, but we didn't actually spend a whole lot of money on counseling. We went through a Relationships Australia, which is government subsidized. So that helped keep it more affordable. And also, we didn't really have that many appointments. We went maybe 8 to 10 times the first year. So it wasn't like we were going, even every, it was once a month really. But we were very serious about, when they recommended books or websites or different tools, I spent a lot of time working through them, and then I took what was useful, and then I asked Steve to work through them with me, and he was good about that. So we took that very seriously. But in terms of other things that, the two key things really were addressing the problems in the marriage and realizing how much better things could be once they were addressed, and valuing my identity as a writer and realizing how important that is to me, how healing that is for me. I had a couple months recently where my work hours have gradually increased, and then they got a little bit too much. I was up to 15 hours a week, and I have the complete flexibility to do that during the week when it suits me, which is the best thing I could possibly ask for. But when I'm doing well, that's fine. But I had a few too many months last year where I was not doing well, and that was too hard. And so because I had that commitment, though, I stopped doing everything else again. And so I stopped writing, and that just made me miserable, and it made me feel disconnected from who I am, and it made it just like it wasn't worth it. So this year I've asked to reduce my work hours again, and had because we're a small organization, like it's a big deal, and it involves a lot of upheaval for a lot of other people. But we're going through that process because I just can't. I'm just not well enough to take on that much.
And you've got clarity. What I'm hearing is the illness provided not just context to get real and raw about things that were under the surface, it also brought you into very sharp focus and clarity about what was important to you. Even if you had limited capacity, this is what you were going to put your energy into.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that it was rewarding for me to do so. That I had made the right choice. I had been honest with what really mattered to me, and so that was really reassuring. And then I guess the other thing is just that, I've had to say no to so many things, and that's something still I think I'll always be working on, because I want to say yes to things. I really do. Like, I wish I didn't have to go to my work and make everything more difficult for everybody else. But I had to do that. I just had no option. So I've gotten a lot better at being more firm about my boundaries and about saying no to things. And I think that even if I magically get fully well again at some point in my life, I think I will still have that skill, and I will still have the confidence to do that.
Thank you so much. It's so rich what you've shared, and it's so honest what you've shared, and you've really revealed what's in your heart. And I want to personally just say to you, that's so nourishing for all the women who are perhaps lying in bed listening to this process, and to hear that you found a way through for yourself, and we haven't glossed over it, and it's not pink fluffy clouds and rainbows and everything's cured.
No.
But you found some parts of you that can move with the illness and still flourish. And I always, I love that final point that you're sharing about the no and having to say no. For me, I think illness It will teach you badass boundaries very quickly. It's a life skill, but you will learn critically how to set a boundary, because you cannot move into your own well-being, even with a limited sphere, without having super good boundaries. And it's a necessary part of your own well-being. And I love to hear that while it's been a struggle, it's something that you've identified as an actual win in the process of being unwell.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one other thing is that I've actually met really amazing people and been able to connect with people differently, because once you've had this experience, and you know, every illness is unique, but at the same time, there's a lot of commonalities. So I've actually, you know, become really good friends with another writer I know who has chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyneuropathy, which is a rare version of Guillain-Barré syndrome. And so he and I host this podcast together now, where we've started interviewing writers and other creatives about health. And we interpret health really broadly. So we've interpreted it in terms of things like intergenerational trauma, for example. But we've also interviewed people with postnatal anxiety. And we just did a fascinating interview with someone who has vulvodynia, which is just very intense chronic pain that can last, like in her case, has lasted for years. And she's just come out with a debut novel fictionalizing some of her experiences and looking at also the history of that condition, and, for example, how it was treated for women in the late 1800s, which was brutal. So just being able to have those conversations on a really intimate level, I don't think I ever would have, you know, ended up pursuing a project like that as a healthy person. And it's introduced me to amazing people and allowed me to connect with them in a really personal way.
Yeah, I feel the same. I feel like we come into these discussions, no matter what the condition, we have a shared heart and we have a shared language, and we can shortcut things with each other. And there's all of these vibrant, beautiful, amazing women, and we don't have to be in silence, and we don't have to be isolated. And this project for me is about making that much more visible with each other, but also that we have an honest conversation about the difficulty and the things that come through it that actually are part of our strength. I'm going to put in all of our show notes. You'll be able to find links to Ashley's books, to the podcast she and James run, which is called Stay at Home, and everything else that you can go and learn about her on her website. Thank you so very much for sharing with us, Ashley. We really appreciate it, and we wish you continued flourishing and well-being in the ways that work for you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about these things, Michelle. It really makes a difference.